Hello and welcome, folks, to the Apologetics Academy. This is a weekly interactive apologetics webinar that we run most Saturdays at 8 p.m. British time. I'm Jonathan McClatchy, and I host this weekly series. You can find the website at apologetics-academy.org, and you can find there the schedule for upcoming webinars. I have some exciting webinars coming up over the next few weeks as well. There's a number of ways you can participate in today's program. You can simply watch and listen anonymously if you wish. You can also click the raise hand button that you can find at the top of your screen, and you can when we get to the Q&A, I'll promote you to be a co-panelist with our special guest speaker. You can also click the Q&A button and submit questions in textual form that way as well. Normally we have a presentation by our guest speaker for up to an hour, and then we open up to open floor Q&A, discussion, dialogue, and debate. So you're very welcome to participate when we get to the Q&A. We bring on different scholars from across the theological spectrum to present to us the topics of interest to Christians, especially those which concern whether or not Christianity is true. We also cross-examine and evaluate other worldviews as well. And we're also interested in questions of design in nature, which is one of the topics that we'll be covering in today's session. We're very honored today to be joined by German paleontologist Dr. Gunter Bechly, who's been on the webinar before. He is an expert on the fossil record and evolution, and he's going to be discussing with us today the implications of the fossil record for common ancestry. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Dr. Bechly. Thanks for coming on.
So thank you, Jonathan. So hello, everybody. Don't think I forgot my Q-tips in the ears. That's the airport. So I hope this improves the sound quality. And as Jonathan already said, we will have a presentation first. So I will switch to screen sharing. Move to presentation. Let's go full screen here. So can everybody see the presentation?
Yep, we can see it.
So topic for today is conflicting evidence for common ancestry from the fossil record. And before we go into the details of the argumentation, there are some terminological issues, because the distinction between common descent and special creation, sometimes it's seen as if it is a very clear-cut binary alternative, either the one or the other. But actually, there is a quite fuzzy border between the two concepts, and that's because special creation can be either ex nihilo, as let's say in the biblical creation of the universe, or it can be from dead matter, let's say Genesis, creation of Adam from the dust of the earth, or it can be creation from living matter. Analogy would be, for example, the incarnation of Christ. So there are different forms of special creation, and special creation can be also done in a biological way. And on the other hand, common descent is quite compatible, let's say, with guided evolution or intelligent design. So the question is, how much intervention in terms of infusion of intelligent information from outside of the system is required in terms of changing the genetic and epigenetic makeup, let's say, of the zygote cell to qualify as special creation rather than common ancestry. So for this talk, I suggest two definitions of these two terms. So I would define universal common ancestry as all life descended biologically from the first living cell, and all biological features of all of life is either inherited from ancestors or based on random errors, so naturalistic undirected changes. And special creation, on the other hand, would be the distinctive makeup, genetic and epigenetic makeup of new biological kinds and complex new biological features is intelligently designed, and if this information is coming from outside of the system, does not inherit it from a common ancestor or based on such naturalistic undirected random changes, then it qualifies as special creation. So just to make clear what I mean when I say there is conflicting evidence to a common ancestry or evidence that could be better explained by special creation. So of course we cannot cherry pick our evidence, and we have to look on at evidence for both sides of the question. So of course there is evidence for common ancestry. Sometimes in the discussion, especially from let's say a young Earth creationist, you hear this notion as if the common ancestry is completely made up and there's no evidence at all, and those evil scientists just try to fool everybody into believing common ancestry. That's actually not true in my view. I think there's quite solid evidence in favor of common ancestry. Common ancestry can be a very good explanation for a lot of different lines of evidence. The question is it the best explanation for all the evidence? So, but let's look briefly at some of the most common cited evidences from the fossil record in favor of common ancestry. One would, of course, be the succession of fossils in the geological column. If you go from lower layers to more younger layers, and you find simple organisms below and more complex organisms overall, of course, with exceptions. If you go up in the geological column, and the more down you go, the more older the layers are, the less similar they are to modern organisms. The more up you go in the layers, the geological layers, the more similar they become to modern organisms. That is usually seen as good evidence for common ancestry. Then there are intermediate forms, intermediate in terms of morphology, between different forms, between forms that are considered as ancestors and forms that are considered as descendants. And then you find fossils that are in between, like Archaeopteryx, so-called missing links or no longer missing links. You have transitional theories, either in terms of morphology or temporally or both, like the horse series or the elephant series, or also the series of human fossils, or the whale series, or the series of fossils from reptile-like mammals or mammal-like reptiles to modern mammals and so on. Then you have something that is called good stratigraphic fit, which means that if you compare the order of branching that is reconstructed in phylogenetic reconstruction based on comparative morphology, then it often fits well with the order of appearance in the fossil record. So that is called good stratigraphic fit. Then you have paleobiogeographical evidences, for example, that you don't find fossil kangaroos just anywhere, but you find them at the very place where you find the recent kangaroos in Australia and nowhere else. And there's the claim there are no out-of-place fossils. So Richard Dawkins famously made this argument, there are no Cambrian rabbits, and if you would find a Cambrian rabbit, then this would disprove Darwinian evolution. We will come back to this later and look if it's really true that there are no out-of-place fossils. And then there are confirmed predictions. And one recent example is some years ago, anthropologists, people working on fossil arthropods, suggested that spiders, the earliest spiders, should have had a kind of tail like a scorpion or like a whip spider, and modern spiders don't have it. And there were at that time no fossils known that have this combination of characters. And indeed, last year, there was a fossil, undisputable fossil spider described from the 100-million-year-old Burmese amber, which has this predicted tail. So predicted, confirmed predictions usually are considered as something that is supporting a hypothesis or a theory. And finally, there's something that is especially interesting or problematic for young Earth creationists, because they often say, because of the problem, how many animals fit on the ark, that there were not all cat species or not all dog species on the ark. There was just one member of the cat kind and one member of the dog kind. And they don't dispute that they go back to a common ancestor, so that foxes and wolves and coyotes have a common ancestor that was on the ark, and that lions and tigers and house cats and lynxes have a common cat kind ancestor that was on the ark. But that there was no common ancestor for dogs and cats and other carnivores and so on. The problem is if you look at the fossil record and you look at the earliest representatives attributed to each of these lineages, then they are among each other more similar than, let's say, modern cats are similar to each other, or modern representatives of the dog kind are similar to each other. So that they would have to be included in a common kind using the same criteria, and then this whole thing would collapse to a kind of universal common ancestry. So group delimitation gets more fuzzy if you introduce fossil evidence and go back in time. So that is basically what the fossil record gives us in terms of evidence that can be interpreted as support for common ancestry. Of course, there are also other interpretations of many of these lines of evidence, and it was often said that many of these evidences can be explained with common design. Recently, one of the attendees today, Winston Everett, has suggested this hypothesis of dependency graphs as explanation, for example, for these hierarchic similarities. So there are alternatives to explain the evidence, but overall, if you would have just this evidence, then one would have to say that common ancestry is the most elegant explanation of the evidence. But this evidence is not all of the evidence, and there are other evidences that don't fit well with the model of common ancestry and the predictions that are following from the assumption of common descent with modification. And the most famous one is the fact that if we assume common ancestry with modification, we should assume that, let's say, with the first form of life, the first living cell, established a population of one species, all members conspecific, and then it differentiated over time into different species, and then different genera, family, orders, classes, and only very late there would be phylum differences of different body plans, for example, of the animal phyla. But what we find in the fossil record, as most of you probably will know, is that in the Cambrian explosion, we have a sudden appearance of all the different animal phyla, and they are not preceded by this kind of bottom-up differentiation. So what we find is a kind of top-down pattern, and then only later in the Ordovician we find this diversification of these different animal phyla in an event that is called GOBE, or the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. So that doesn't really confirm the prediction of the hypothesis of common ancestry with modification. And another prediction of Darwinism and of common ancestry with modification is gradualism. And that is not just a made-up criterion by Darwin doubters and Darwin critics. Darwin himself used the Latin phrase Natura non facit saltus, nature doesn't make jumps, 6 times in his Origin of Species, against the advice of his friend Thomas Huxley. And he did it with good reason, because he was quite aware that any kind of saltation requires a kind of miraculous causation. It doesn't fit well with a naturalistic explanation. And if you need a miraculous explanation for the saltation, then having common ancestry as naturalistic explanation for the pattern of similarities isn't as elegant as it seemed before. So he insisted on gradualism, and this is still the case. Richard Dawkins, in his famous book, The Greatest Show on Earth, in 2009, wrote, and that's quote, evolution not only is a gradual process as a matter of fact, it has to be gradual if it is to do any explanatory work. And of course, we all know that the fossil record isn't supporting this kind of gradualism. This prediction is not confirmed by the fossil record, and the usual explanation is that the fossil record is incomplete. We will address this in a second. But before, we have to address something else, and that is the measure for calling something gradual or saltational or non-continuous, discontinuous. And this measure is, of course, different to our everyday life. In everyday life, something is abrupt or discontinuous when it happens, boom, in a second. If we look in the fossil record and the history of life, then events that we call abrupt or sudden take millions of years. And then you might ask the legit question, isn't this then rather gradual if it takes 10 million years or 5 million years? But actually it's not, and the reason is that if you look at the standard textbook wisdom, what is the longevity, so the lifespan of a species, not of the individual members of a species, but of the whole species from its coming into existence, over existing and then going out of existing by either extinction or dissolving into a daughter species, then the estimates, depending on the group of organisms, go between 2.5 and 10 million years. So if we have, for example, a 5 million year window of time for the appearance of certain body structures of certain groups, that is equal to just a succession of 1 or 2 species, and that is indeed abrupt if you imagine that something like a bird feather or something like a transition from a land-living animal to a marine whale should happen with just 1 or 2 species. This isn't possible with a gradualistic process of common ancestry with modification in a naturalistic way. It's only possible by miraculous intervention into infusion of information from outside, and that is special creation. So let's look if the fossil record is qualifying as evidence for this kind of saltationism. And as I already mentioned, Darwin was aware of the problem of the fossil record, and he said, well, that's just, the fossil record is incomplete. We have such a poor knowledge of the fossil record. If we would have a complete knowledge, then it would be the continuum that my theory predicts. And indeed, even today, famous paleontologists like Philip Gingerich, he alluded to a famous quote which says, lack of evidence is lack of evidence, not evidence of lack. And he said gaps of evidence are gaps of evidence, not evidence of gaps. So he means gaps in the fossil record. But is this really true? And my colleague Paul Nelson, he suggested an analogy to illustrate that we can indeed make an estimate if this is the case or not. And that is, if you imagine that you would have a new hobby, you do beach combing and you walk along the shore, and in the beginning you find new stuff every day, new shells of mussels and snails and so on. But after a while, things start to repeat, and when you only find the same stuff over and over again, you know that you have sampled sufficiently what is out there to know that what is lacking because it's not there, and not because you haven't sampled enough. So you're not suffering from an artifact of undersampling. And this criterion is actually used in paleontology. It's called there the collector curve. And the collector curve is a graph where you have in the horizontal axis the effort that has to be invested to find something new. So, for example, to discover new fossils, and you could measure this effort in man hours or in grant money or whatever you prefer. And in the vertical axis, you have the discovered new forms. And this curve is steep in the beginning, and later it flattens. So in the beginning, you find easily with not much effort interesting new stuff. You dig a little hole here and you find something new, and so on. But later, when this curve flattens, you find the same stuff over and over again, and it takes a lot of effort to find something really interesting new. And this method has been used to test the fossil record. There's a famous paper of Fut and Sapkowski in 1999, published in Nature. And they came to the result that in most groups of animals, the completeness of the fossil record is rather high. So we are not longer in the state of Darwin, where we could have this escape clause that these seemingly abrupt appearances are just gaps of evidence. They are really data that have to be explained. So in other talks, I have already talked in very much detail about these different abrupt origins. So I will go very quickly through some of them for those of you who haven't heard about all this evidence. So it starts with the origin of life. Meanwhile, we have evidence for origin of life about 4.1 billion years ago. And that is at the very earliest possible time in Earth's history where life could be sustained at all. And this has to do with an astronomic event that is called the Late Heavy Bombardment. And before there were simply no oceans that persisted and would have allowed life to persist. And the same holds for the origin of photosynthesis. We have meanwhile evidence, indirect paleobiochemical evidence for the origin of photosynthesis 3.8 billion years ago. That is right at the end of the late heavy bombardment, when the oceans were no longer evaporized into the atmosphere, and photosynthesizing algae could be sustained in the oceans, and boom, you have this right at the beginning, and not after a long process. If you look at the complexity of the involved proteins for the photosynthesis, we should expect to find something like this after hundreds of millions of years of evolution by common ancestry and modification, not at the very beginning where it was possible in Earth history. And if we look at the first macrofossils, it's the same thing. They appear suddenly out of thin air in a time that is called the Avalon Explosion, and the name explosion already signifies that it's a sudden event. That name, it wasn't invented by creationists, but it's a common term in paleontology. The Avalon Explosion, it's the origin of this strange Ediacaran fauna with this very strange morphology, with flight symmetry and fructal growth, and this kilted air mattress-like structure and no visible inner organs. And they appeared within a 10 million year window of time, which sounds much, but it's just one or two marine invertebrate species in succession. Before, you just had single-celled organism, so protists and bacteria, and then boom, you have these very complex and large organisms, of which nobody really knows what it is, if there are plants, animals, fungi. Recently in a blog post discussed recent claim that this animal here on the lower left, Dickinsonia, is an animal. I think the arguments against this claim are pretty strong. And then, of course, there's the Cambrian explosion, which shows this top-down pattern of appearance of most of the known animal phyla, something like arthropods or mollusks or corals, or all these kind of marine invertebrates that appear suddenly without any kind of precursors before in the fossil record. It has been called evolution's Big Bang on one of the titles of Time magazine. And of course, people tried to get rid of this unpleasant fact. The most common argument against the Cambrian explosion, apart from disputing the abruptness in terms of timing, but all people who really work in paleontology on the Cambrian explosion actually agree on the timing. The most common argument was that it's an artifact and that similar sediments are lacking from earlier times, and if they would be there, then we would find the precursors, that they didn't have hard skeletons, were soft-bodied, and we couldn't find them in the Ediacaran sediments. But actually, this was disproved recently by discovery of Burgess Shale-like deposits from the Ediacaran in Mongolia and China. And what we find there is only algae and no animals at all. And even the paleontologists who are specialized on these organisms agree that animals are absent at this time, not because we didn't find them, but because they didn't originate yet. By what process, whatever. Another argument against the Cambrian explosion was this argument from the small shelly fauna, that there's a continuum of these shell fragments from Ediacaran shelly fauna to the Cambrian shelly fauna, that there you would find the ancestors of the Cambrian explosion. Actually, that's not true. It's a kind of fallacy of equivocation. The shelly faunas are very different between the Cambrian and the Ediacaran. There's no continuity, and all the shelly fossils from the Ediacaran can be attributed to Coelenteroids at best. And they are not the ancestors of the Cambrian explosion. So this abruptness of the appearance of the Cambrian phyla still stands. And it still stands also in terms of the trace fossil record. And that was a strong argument until a recent paper came in 2016 The interesting thing is that in the Cambrian, you find these great variety of trace fossils, not only on the seafloor, but also digging into the seafloor. So it's also called the Cambrian substrate revolution. And in the Ediacaran, you find few fossils of traces, and they are all restricted to the surface. But people said, well, but they are the simple precursors of the Cambrian animal phyla. But actually then came the study of Mariotti et al. In 2016, and they said, well, we know the Ediacaran habitat was dominated by bacterial mats on the seafloor. So let's look what happens to these bacterial mats if we let them grow in the aquarium tank and stir them up and let them settle again. And actually they could reproduce all these kind of Ediacaran trace fossils by simply stirring up bacterial mats, and then you get all these kind of folding structures in the artifacts. So there are no actual precursors of actively moving animals in terms of trace fossil record in the Ediacaran. This argument collapsed as well. And then there was another recent paper which made the claim, oh, the Cambrian explosion wasn't really sudden. It extended from 550 million years ago till 518 million years ago or something. So it was much longer. But actually, if you look at the paper, it proves exactly the opposite. What they found was they looked at arthropods, and they found that the oldest crown group arthropods are found 518 stem arthropods, so the oldest precursors, like things like Anomalocaros and Hallucigenia, these walking worms, were found in sediments 518 million years ago. And then there are trilobites, crown group arthropods, real arthropods with compound eyes and hard skeletons and articulated legs, 521 million years ago. So 3 million years older than their alleged ancestors. And this, of course, implied that people had to postulate a kind of ghost lineage. So if the descendants are younger, older than the alleged ancestors, then the ancestors have to be much older again, and so you have to postulate them, even though there is no fossil record of them. And then they thought, well, let's look at the trace fossil record, and what they discovered is indeed trace fossils of arthropods that are 537 million years ago. But the problem is, even though most trace fossils cannot be identified as really the precise maker of the trace fossil, but in this case it was quite possible. It is the so-called Rosoficus trace, and this is a typical trace of trilobites. So again, it's the descendants which are older and which go back now 537 million years by trace fossil records. So they are 20 million years older than their alleged ancestors that are found 580 million years ago, not really fitting with the prediction of common ancestry to find this reverse pattern. It's also called a kind of temporal paradox. And the authors acknowledge that these new localities found in Mongolia and in China prove that animals and also arthropods did not exist before the time of, let's say, something like 550 million years ago. That's what they also write in the abstract of the paper. And so they said, well, then exactly afterward it must have happened. So from 550 million years ago till 518 million years ago, arthropods evolved gradually, and therefore it was not an explosion. But what the data actually say is, before 550 million years ago, there were no arthropods at all. And at 537 million years ago, we already have evidence for trilobites, which have compound eyes, hard skeleton, articulated legs, the whole body plan of complete crown group arthropods. So you just have 30 million years. That's 1.5 arthropod species in terms of species longevity to get from a protozoan to a trilobite. That's absurd. So this paper actually proves the opposite of the claim that is made in the paper itself, if you look at the real data and the evidence. And if you look further in the fossil record, then you find these sudden appearances everywhere. So let's rush through it. In the Ordovician, you have this biodiversification event where you have a sudden big bang of diversification of marine invertebrates. It has been called life's second big bang. Also in a very short window of time, with a maximum at about 470 million years ago. at the transition of the next geological age between the Silurian and Devonian, you have the sudden appearance of the oldest land plants, including the oldest fossils that we have from land plants at all already belong to modern club mosses. So again, you don't find the precursors, the more primitive precursors that would have been postulated by the theory of common ancestry and modification. In the Devonian, you find a very quick turnover of the complete marine biota. If you look at this chart below, you see three colors, and these three colors symbolize three different ways how organisms in marine habitats can live. They can either live close to the ground, that is the brown part, that is called demersal, or they can live passively drifting in the water column, that is called platonic life, that's the green part, and or they can be active swimmers like fish or cephalopods, that's the blue part. And you see that suddenly in the Devonian, in a 10 million year window of time, from nearly no active swimmers, you have active swimmers dominating marine biodiversity without having any kind of gradual transition between these two very different kind of marine biota. And correlated with this is the appearance of tooth structures, which has been called the Odontode explosion, again, because of the suddenness of the event. In different groups of fish, cartilaginous fish like sharks and ray relationships, and in rayfin fish and lowfin fish, you find all these kinds of different tooth structures appearing suddenly out of nowhere. And in my own group of expertise in insects, you find in the Carboniferous the sudden appearance of all the different orders that would be groups like the bugs and beetles and dragonflies and roaches and locusts and so on. They appear without precursors before, they're just there, and it's not only primitive insects like mayflies and dragonflies and roaches. Meanwhile, we even found Carboniferous representatives of several groups of holometabolan insects that would be something like wasps and beetles and scorpion flies, insects which have this complete metamorphosis with the pupa stage where the whole animal is dissolved and reorganized. Something that you would expect to find very late as a very sophisticated evolutionary achievement and not at the very beginning of the first flying insect. In the Triassic, you have a real carpet bombing of these kind of explosions. There has been a book by a guy who is a real hostile to any idea of creationism or intelligent design, Peter Ward, who once had a debate with Steve Meyer. And his book, who's addressing this Triassic sudden origin, is called Out of Thin Air, and it has this title not for nothing. So in the Triassic, you have the sudden appearance of, for example, the recent subgroups of tetrapods, or the first mammal representatives, the first relatives of iguanas, of lizards, the first representatives of the crocodile lineage, the first representatives of the dinosaur lineage, and the first representatives of the turtle lineage. And if you look at the marine biota, you have within just 8 million years an increase from no marine reptile families to 15 different families of marine reptiles. So after the great mass extinction at the end of the Permian age. So this is just a little overview of these different marine reptiles, and among them, of course, ichthyosaurs, where you have a transition from supposed lizard-like, monitor lizard-like ancestors living at the shore to completely fish-like, dolphin-like ichthyosaurs within a window of time of about 4 million years, which is absolutely impossible. That would be a transition of a single species to make this kind of change in body plan. You have the same in the Triassic in terms of gliding and actively flying animals, including the first pterosaurs in just a 2 million year window of time. And even dinosaurs appear suddenly. There has been a recent paper, 2018, in Nature Communications. And here's a quote from the paper: "Explosive increase in dinosaurian abundance. It's amazing how clear-cut the change from no dinosaurs to all dinosaurs was." And if you look at other groups, even if you go into lower taxonomic levels, for example, to this group of Mosasaurs, which is a kind of marine group of monitor lizards, you have a sudden diversification and appearance of these Mosasaurs in the Cretaceous. And what is very striking is that they are not just marine monitors which have maybe lost their limbs and transformed them into flippers. We have meanwhile soft part preserved animals which show that these animals also had reorganization of their internal organs, similar to whales, for example. In terrestrial vertebrates, usually the bronchi are split, and in whales, as adaptation to marine lifestyle, they are parallel, and the same has been documented in soft part preserved Mosasaurs from the Cretaceous. So they involve pretty complex reorganizations in a very short window of time. Origin of flowering plants was already known to Darwin as what he called the abominable mystery, because it refuted his gradualist expectations. And here's a quote from 2015 from a paper which said then about 125 million years ago, angiosperms, that's flowering plants, and their flowers sprang forth during the Cretaceous period as fully formed as Aphrodite. Again, not really what is predicted by the theory of common ancestry. The same you find in butterflies, which appear suddenly in the lower Tertiary and the Paleogene and Eocene. The same is in birds, where all the groups of modern birds appear in a 10 million year window of time in the lower Tertiary. The same is true in placental mammals, which appear in many cases fully formed. For example, what you see here are the photos, the two oldest known bats, and in the middle you see a drawing of a modern bat skeleton. So you see the oldest bats are already looking like the modern ones, not a transition, let's say, from a kind of gliding squirrel to an actively flying bat. And that is true for all mammals. We will come back to this graph when we talk about the mismatch between molecular clocks and fossil data. Therefore, I will move further to our own fossil history. And there's this common belief that, well, we have this transitional series from Australopithecine ape-like ancestors to Homo erectus and then modern humans. But actually, that's not true. And here's a quote from John Hawkes, who is one of the most popular mainstream paleoanthropologists. Nothing to do with no Darwin doubter, no intelligent design proponent, no creationist, completely mainstream Darwinian. He says, in sum, the earliest Homo sapiens remains differ significantly from Australopithecines in both size and anatomical details. And so far as we can tell, the changes were sudden and not gradual. And as comment to his study, there was this headline in the popular science press: new studies suggest Big Bang theory of human evolution. So the sudden origin is true for our own origin as well. And it's even true if you look at cultural achievements, where you find, I have plotted here in green, cultural innovation in terms of simple tool use, and in brown, cultural innovations that involve symbolic thinking. And we have a high concentration of origin of symbolic thinking in this so-called Upper Paleolithic, which has been therefore called the Upper Paleolithic Human Revolution. And there is a recent debate if this is still true. If we look at new findings that have been made in Africa, but the general consensus is that it's still true that the appearance of symbolic thinking and of evidence for, let's say, musical instrument and art appeared suddenly in the Upper Paleolithic about 50,000 years ago. So that is one line of evidence, are these abrupt appearances which conflict with the prediction of gradualism made from the common ancestry hypothesis. But there are other problems in the fossil record as well. And one is if you make reconstructions of trees, and here you have a tree of ichthyosaurs, and horizontally you have the time axis from the Triassic or the Jurassic going to the Cretaceous, where ichthyosaurs then went extinct. Then we should expect expect if you have splits, dichotomies in these phylogenetic trees that have been reconstructed based on comparative morphology, that sister lineages should have the same age. But actually what you find is that in most cases, one branch is documented very old in the fossil record, and the other branch is maybe not documented for 30, 40 million years, as for example here, I hope you can see the mouse cursor at the lower part of the diagram. So this mismatch between the proposed age of the lineage based on the fact that two sister lineages which originate from the same splitting event have to have the same age, and the actual fossil documentation of the two sister lineages in terms of fossil record, this mismatch results in the fact that paleontologists have to postulate so-called ghost lineages, that are lineages that are simply theoretically postulated based on the assumption of common ancestry, but they are not suggested by the actual fossil record. So if you're honest, you would have to acknowledge that the fossil record doesn't really agree with this cladogram. And this gets even worse if you compare the fossil record with age estimates of the lineages in terms of molecular data. And there you get very, very long ghost lineages. And what you see here is the blue tree. Here is the most modern molecular phylogenetic tree of mammalian orders. So the mammalian orders would be things like carnivores and paired and even and uneven hoofed animals and primates and so on. And the branching pattern is based on a comparison of genetic data, sometimes added with morphological data, and the horizontal axis is time, and the point in time of the branching is made by the so-called molecular clock study. And these are modern molecular clock studies who use all kinds of sophisticated procedures like relaxed clocks, not assuming a constant ticking molecular clock, using multiple fossil calibration points. And still, if you look at the actual fossil record, and that is are the red dots, then you see that all the mammalian orders have their oldest fossil records in the lower tertiary, or in the Paleogene, as it is called today, in this yellow strip. And none of them is found where they should be expected according to the molecular clock data. And that is not only found in mammals, it's the same thing in plants, in angiosperm plants, it's the same thing in land plants generally, it's the same in birds, it's the same if you look at the origin of multicellular animals or bilaterian animals, or at the origin of the eukaryote cell. Everywhere there is a very strong mismatch between molecular data and fossil data. And it's even bigger, the mismatch, considering the fact that these modern methods that I mentioned, relaxed clocks and multiple fossil calibration points, that sounds neat, but it's nothing else than cheating, because multiple fossil calibration points means you adjust your rates of change of the molecular clock according to the expected range of age in which this whole thing should fit according to the fossil data that you already have. So you fudge the molecular data according to the fossil data, and then you say, hooray, we don't have a strong mismatch as before between the molecular clock and the fossil record. And still, even using this, you still have a mismatch. If you wouldn't use multiple fossil calibration points, then the mismatch would be several times bigger than illustrated in this diagram. So this shouldn't be expected if common ancestry is true. All the different lines of evidence should converge to the same result. Next problem is the so-called waiting time problem. I have elaborated on this thing before in other talks, and it has also been explained in other videos that you can find on YouTube. Below you find this link here to a video that explains this whale example. basically the waiting time problem says that if you combine the fossil record and population genetics, then you get a problem for the neo-Darwinian mechanism, because the established windows of time in terms of the fossil record do not accommodate the waiting times that you need for the required mutations to originate in the population and to spread in the population, to become fixed in the population. And then you have several parameters with which you can play. If the population is big, then you have a longer waiting time for the fixation, but a shorter waiting time for the origin, because you have more possibilities to play for mutations. And if you have a small population, then you have a longer waiting time to get the mutations, but a very short fixation time. So changing the population size doesn't solve the problem. Also, sexual recombination doesn't solve the problem. This has been studied, and the result was that it has only minor effect. It's an unsolved problem for Darwinism, and it shows that even if you accept all the fossils, all the datings, and even the phylogenetic trees, then the naturalistic transitions are impossible without a kind of infusion of information from outside, because in the case of whales, you would have to have a transition from a pig-like ancestor like Pachycetide to a completely marine dolphin-like animal like Dorudon within 4.5 million years, which is lifespan of a single larger mammal species. So that's another problem from the fossil record for common ancestry and for the neo-Darwinian process. Another problem is stasis, where nothing happens, and where you should expect if common ancestry and modification is true, and this molecular clock is ticking, and with each new species descending from their parent species, you get changes, and the changes accumulate. Why do you have lineages that don't change at all? And we all know these examples of living fossils like the coelacanth or the tuatara lizard or the nautilus or the ginkgo tree. A very striking example is horseshoe crabs. If you look at horseshoe crabs, the photo here is a recent horseshoe crab. This brown, dark brown illustration is the recent horseshoe crab Limulus polyphemus. The lighter brown on the right side is a fossil species looking absolutely identical. Limulus darwini, 150 million years old. Below you see here Limulitella thairensis from the Triassic of Tunisia. It's a 250 million years old, still looking absolutely identical. And even if you go back nearly 500 million years, they are the oldest horseshoe crabs are still looking very, very similar in terms of body plan. So why could they survive for 500 million years and not change? And other animals that were much more diverse in terms of species and different adaptations to different habitats like trilobites went extinct. The usual explanation is natural selection. Natural selection is transformative when environmental conditions change, and it's stabilizing when environmental conditions stay the same. So it's a kind of explanation for everything. It can be of unlimited transformative power, and it can be impotent in terms of morphological transformation, depending on the environment. But is it actually plausible, for example, in the case of horseshoe crabs, if you think they existed for 500 million years, and in this time happened all the 5 major mass extinction events, which mostly extinguished between 50 and 90% of marine biodiversity, that the environmental conditions didn't change for them, and major revolutions of all marine ecosystems happened, like the Devonian Nekton revolution that I mentioned earlier, where you had this complete turnover from planktonic to actively swimming biodiversity, and the environmental conditions didn't change for horseshoe crabs. Is it really plausible? No, it is not. And the other escape clause is, well, then maybe it's just contingent. It's you have in the game of evolution, it's a contingent process, and you have losers and you have winners, and trilobites were the lucky winners, and were the unlucky losers, and horseshoe crabs were the lucky winners. But actually, the phenomenon of convergence that has been elaborated, for example, by paleontologist Simon Conway Morris in 2 books, shows that evolution does not seem to be so much contingent, but because the same solutions are found over and over again independently, so there seem to be strong constraints. And then you cannot say, well, just stuff happens and it's all contingent. So that was stasis. And then we have finally another nail in the coffin, and that is Darwin's theory of common ancestry predicts, of course, transition between species, not only major transitions in terms of macroevolution, but also just from, let's say, one foraminiferan species to another foraminiferan species, from an ancestor to a descendant. And we should find these gradual species transitions, of course, at least in those cases where we have undisturbed layers of sediments over longer periods of time. And since paleontologists expect to find these gradual species-to-species transitions, they looked in these deep sea sediments, for example, and there are only very few cases of alleged fossil evidence for gradual species transitions, so few that it's already very striking and posing a problem in itself. But the bigger problem is that even these few cases have been refuted in the past years. So one of the most famous textbook showcases for alleged fossil gradual species-to-species transition evidence is the case of the marine foraminiferan of the genus Globirotalia from the species Plesiotomida to Tumida. You find it in a lot of textbooks as the proof that gradual transitions happen. And actually here you have a paper from 2009 published in PNAS, and the title says it all: evidence for abrupt speciation in a classic case of gradual evolution. The paper deals with the case Globirotalia Plesiotomida to Tumida and refutes that it's an evidence for gradual species transition. And one of the few other examples were freshwater snails of the genus Gyraulus, which is still existing from the Steinheim basin in Germany, Miocene lake basin. And these fossil snails have been used by German paleontologist Franz Hilgendorf, who in 1866 made the first phylogenetic tree, the first fossil evidence for Darwin's theory, and the first phylogenetic tree using fossils and allegedly showing gradual species-to-species transition of these freshwater lake snails. But there was a very early critique of his results, which said, well, are these really species-to-species transition, or are these just so-called ecophenotypes? That means different morphs of the same species in the same lake, depending on different ecological niches in the lake. And actually, a modern study recently in 2015 exactly confirmed these early critique. The authors, Kluing et al., they studied the genus Gyraulus in deep lakes on the Tibetan plateau, and what they found is that they found all these different types of shells within the same species, in the same lake, at the same time. So it's not gradual species-to-species transition, it's indeed just ecophenotypes. And is this maybe just some selected exceptions, just some bias that I looked for? No, there's a study by Hunt, 2010, and he looked for all the fossil evidence for species-level transformation in the light of 150 years of paleontological research since Darwin. And here's a quote from his abstract. The meandering and fluctuating trajectories captured in the fossil record are not inconsistent with the centrality of natural selection as an evolutionary mechanism, but they probably would not have been predicted without the benefit of an empirical fossil record. Well, this is, of course, a showcase for obfuscated language, but if you really read it carefully, what you find is the fossil record actually shows nothing like directional change in a gradual way from one species to the other, but a meandering and fluctuating back and forth. And you don't find any kind of gradual species-to-species transition. So the fossil record contradicts the expectations from common ancestry hypothesis. So some other fossil evidences against common ancestry. There's also not only good stratigraphic fit, that the stratigraphic order fits with the reconstructed phylogenetic order. There's also poor stratigraphic fit, so-called temporal paradoxes. And one of the most famous examples is the dinosaur bird transition, where Archaeopteryx and early birds have the same age as their alleged ancestors. Feathered dinosaurs that have been found in China, for example, are consistently younger than the oldest birds, or at best the same age. And the same we find in early tetrapods, where traces of fully tetrapod-like amphibians have been found that are older than even the oldest lobe-finned-like fish that are supposed to be ancestors of tetrapods. So where the fossil record doesn't fit with the order of branching predicted by reconstructions of cladograms. So evolutionists have only three possible explanations. Either the phylogenetic tree contains errors, or the fossil record is incomplete and misleading, or both. But what they don't consider, of course, is the underlying assumption of common descent, that this could be wrong. And that is a fourth alternative. And actually, that is suggested by the evidence. And what they can do is that they fudge the result by using methods like stratocladistics, where you use the age and the stratigraphic order of appearance of the fossil as input data in the reconstruction of the cladograms, and then you can make the this mismatch disappear a little bit. But of course, this is the same way of cheating as using multiple fossil calibration points for getting less mismatch in the molecular clocks. So generally, if good stratigraphic fit counts evidence for common ancestry, then if you're honest, then you have to acknowledge that poor stratigraphic fit qualifies as conflicting evidence. And then you have to look what is the total evidence and look for the best explanation. Another thing is fossil evidence versus Evo-Devo evidence. If we look at different lines of evidence concerning the origin of certain body structures and evolutionary scenarios, how they came into being, then we should expect that different lines of evidence converge to the same hypothesis. But actually, that's not the case. In many cases, fossil evidence and Evo-Devo evidence, genetic evidence, embryological evidence, gives very different theories how structures came into being. For example, in case of insect wings, where one line of evidence suggests the origin of insect wings from stiff dorsal outgrowths of the exoskeleton, and the other evidence suggests that they originated from mobile leg-like appendages used as gills and in aquatic larvae. And same in birds, where the homology of bird fingers, fossil evidence and some embryological evidence suggests that the remaining 3 fingers in bird wings are fingers 1, 2, 3. Other evidences say it's 2, 3, 4, and a few say even it's 1, 3, 4. And people try to explain this strange phenomenon by suggesting an ad hoc hypothesis that there was a strange homeotic frame shift, that the Anlagen for the fingers shifted and the thumb didn't produce the thumb anymore, but the index finger and so on. So there is clearly a mismatch between different lines of evidence. And paleobiogeography is not always like the kangaroo, where you have congruence, but there are conundrums in paleobiogeography, where, for example, if you look at the data from fossils and the geological data from plate tectonics, then you have to postulate to explain the origin of New World monkeys, that a group of about 100 monkeys rafted for 60 days for 1,400 kilometers from Africa to South America across the early Atlantic Ocean. Even though in the whole history of human seafaring, we have never seen any kind of mammal drifting on vegetation across open ocean. The only thing that we have found is that some lizard drifted maybe for 200 kilometers between some Caribbean islands. So, and they have, of course, it easier in terms of metabolism and living for several days without water than animals like monkeys or other animals. So there are a lot of such examples, rat-eated birds, flightless birds like the kiwi and the moa, elephant birds, and so on. How did they distribute? Meanwhile, evolutionists postulate that these ostrich-like habitats developed independently, and they were flying to their current distribution areas from flying ancestors, even though nandus, rheas, and ostriches and emus look very much alike. There has been a recent example where tarantula spiders have been postulated to have been drifting 10,000 kilometers from Africa to Australia. And there are postulates that 3 or 5 times independently subterranean blind warm lizards, who are not very likely to drift into the open ocean, had to make transoceanic travels to explain the current distributional patterns. The same with bowing snakes and iguanas. And what is even more problematic is in those cases where we should expect this kind of drifting. For example, when India was approaching by continental drift the Asian continent, and it was only separated anymore for 200 kilometers, and then you should have this starting exchange by drifting animals across this marine street. There is no evidence whatsoever that something like this happened. The same in Madagascar, between Madagascar and Africa. So this is a paleobiogeographical problem for common ancestry. And another thing is, if you look at the recent distribution of character similarities, sometimes everything looks clear. So for example, if you compare the morphology of elephants, of sea cows, of manatees, and of an extinct group called Desmostylians, there are different morphological characters that suggest that they form a clade, a monophyletic group called Tititherians. And all these 3 groups of animals have a unique, highly derived mode of tooth replacement, where the molars, the cheek teeth, are shifted forward and replaced from behind. This is not happening in any other kind of mammal. And they are considered to be closely related anyway. So of course, you should expect that this is based on common ancestry and inherited by their common ancestor. But actually, if you look at the oldest representatives of the elephant lineage, they don't have horizontal tooth replacement. If you look at the oldest representatives of the Sirenian lineage, they don't have horizontal tooth replacement, and the same in the extinct Desmostylians. So what appeared to be a consistent, congruent pattern among recent animals or among the more derived groups turns out to be not based on common ancestry if you look at the earlier representatives. And then there's the ad hoc hypothesis, maybe it's underlying apomorphies, maybe there's some genetic tendency that has been inherited, but it has been independently realized. But of course, this is completely ad hoc, there's no evidence for that. And then we have this claim there are no out-of-place fossils, no Cambrian rabbits. And actually this claim is especially made by non-paleontologists like Richard Dawkins, who doesn't know that stuff like this happens, and we find something like this. So for example, some years ago, there has been a bryophyte, a land plant fossil being published from the early Middle Cambrian from China, very well preserved fossil. There's no any kind of suggestion that this is a falsified fossil, a hoax from China. It's well preserved. There's no doubt about the identification. There's no doubt about the dating of the layers. That should be interesting. It's an out-of-place fossil. Of course, all the paleontologists and paleobotanists jumped on this fossil and looked at it. No, they ignored it. And if you Google Parafunaria, the genus, you find maybe 5 or 6 papers that even mention it. And what you find is that they quote another paper that this probably is not real. And if you look at this other paper, they just have a single sentence where they say, well, probably it's not real because it doesn't fit. But nobody ever bothered to look at the actual fossil and look, is there something wrong, and reanalyze the actual data. Same happened with a modern insect, the Trisanopteran larva from the Devonian Rhynie chert from Scotland. There even, paleontologists suggested that, now I recognize why this wasn't full screen, sorry. And paleontologists suggested that they were contamination of recent insects that entered somewhere via cracks into this Devonian stone, and then the stone was miraculously dissolved and recrystallized, and so we find a recent insect in the Devonian stone. But we can check this and can see if there is a difference in preservation to legit Devonian fossils in the same outcrop, and you can see recrystallization. It changes the matrix of the mineral of this chert. But did every paleontologist ever bother to check this material? No, they ignored it. So what happens to out-of-place fossils? They exist and they are not used to refute common ancestry. They are simply ignored and nobody looks at them as soon as they are published, and they are forgotten. So all these different lines of evidence, they are clearly conflicting evidence to the common ancestry hypothesis, and what they require are a kind of ad hoc explanation, fancy just so stories to explain this conflicting evidence away. And you end up with this phenomenon like Ptolemaios, that you have to add epicycle and epicycle to get rid of unpleasant data. But of course, that's not how science should proceed. We should look for the best explanation of all the data. And that, at least the neo-Darwinian mechanism, doesn't explain all the data, is acknowledged by mainstream evolutionary biologists. And there has been this famous conference in London, 2016, New Trends in Evolutionary Biology, where Gerd Müller, one of the most famous theoretical evolutionary biologists of our age, in his keynote, among the different phenomena that neo-Darwinism does not explain, among what he called explanatory deficits of the modern synthesis, he mentioned non-gradualism, non-gradual forms of origin in the fossil record. So this is recognized by mainstream evolutionary biologists as a conflicting evidence and as a non-explained phenomenon by neo-Darwinism. So to sum up, we have a lot of different lines of evidence, fossil evidence against evolution in the sense of common ancestry with modification, this top-down pattern instead of bottom-up, fossil discontinuities with abrupt appearances and non-gradual species-to-species transition, this mismatch between molecular clocks and the fossil record, ghost lineages, these much too short windows of time for the required genetic changes, the so-called waiting time problem, the stasis, the living fossil problem, the poor stratigraphic fit resulting in temporal paradoxes, the mismatch between Evo-Devo and fossil evidence, Paleobiogeographical Conundrums, homoplasy in early representatives, these underlying apomorphies, and existing out-of-place fossils. So what about common ancestry? Actually, of course, as I said, common ancestry and common descent is well compatible with hypotheses like intelligent design. But if we consider all the available evidence, then we have to ask, is common descent still the best explanation for all the evidence, or don't we have to look for other possible explanations to explain the evidence that seems to favor common ancestry? And are there equally good explanation? And actually, in a recent book chapter that I co-authored with Steve Meyer, we suggested one possible alternative to explain the hierarchical pattern of similarity and also this pattern of appearance in the fossil record with something that is more related to a hierarchical pattern of forms ordered in the mind of the intelligent designer. And recently, Winston Everett suggested this dependency graph hypothesis. So there are alternative explanations. So I would suggest that common ancestry, at least it is legit based on the fossil evidence, to question it. So that would be my presentation for today. I hope it wasn't too long. Sorry that I discovered only at the end how to get it full screen. Hope you could see the pictures anyway. And now we could go to Q&A.
Excellent, Gunter. Thank you so much. Do you want to unshare your screen? There you go. Great.
Okay.
Great. Folks, this is the interactive portion of the program. If
right.
you'd like to interact with Dr. Bechly, then you can click the raise hand button at the top of your screen. I'll be glad to promote you to panelist. You can also, if you prefer, submit a question in textual form. If you hit the Q&A button at the top of your screen, you can submit anonymously if you wish. I can also take questions on Facebook if people are watching there. I want to submit questions in that way as well. Interesting. A lot of the material you raised actually was new to me. Some really fascinating.
Okay, that's good.
So, yeah. On biogeographical conundrums, that's been a topic that's been of interest to me for quite some time. Like you mentioned, the New World monkeys and their origin.
Right.
You know, are we to envision these rafting monkeys going over from Africa to South America? There's other examples that are, I mean, the Pacific. I mean, the Atlantic right now is basically it's as large as it's ever been. It's never been larger than it is now. But with the Pacific, it's never been smaller. It's never been smaller.
Right.
And so, with some of the trans-Pacific biogeographical mismatches is quite interesting, I think. I used to have a professor when I did a master's program in evolutionary biology, and this professor, on the basis of biogeographical evidence, chose to subscribe to the expanding Earth theory.
Okay, interesting.
So basically, the idea that the Earth is expanding, and tried to explain, because he couldn't explain the biogeographical evidence any other way, and so he decided to cling to the expanding Earth theory.
But of course he didn't question
no, he didn't question. Exactly. Yes.
he would have, maybe he considered hollow Earth, but not that Darwin is true.
Yeah. There's some quite good review papers actually of these conundrums of biogeographical distribution.
Right. If you Google this problem, also this rafting hypothesis, I did a little bit research to find what are actual recent examples, and the only thing I found is that some years ago there has been a hurricane in the Caribbean, and there was within the Windward Islands there was a transportation across on a drifting piece of wood of a dozen unnoticed lizards, but that was just 200 kilometers between two islands within the Caribbean. And the longest really rafting that I have found that is suggested plausibly is an Aldabra giant tortoise, which drifted to the coast of Kenya about 750 kilometers, drifted probably about, according to the marine currents, for 2 weeks. But of course, a turtle, based on turtle physiology, can make this travel relatively easily. For mammals who have to drink and have to eat, and which don't lay eggs and don't have a large rate of reproduction, where you need a certain population to get this whole thing going when they arrive in South America, it doesn't help if you have one monkey 10,000 years in time, and then 10,000 years later, one monkey 5,000 kilometers further south. Or so you need a population at the same place at the same time to reproduce. And this is completely ridiculous. Even at this time, where the South Atlantic still was smaller, it would have been nearly 1,500 kilometers. And we have reconstructions of these marine currents at this time. And there has been a paper which said, well, without sailing, and sailing means they were rafting on a float that had upright standing trees, which still had foliage and then could be pushed by the wind much faster than drafting driftwood or something. If it's just drafting, you would have needed something like 60 days to make the voyage, which is impossible for mammals to make. And the sailing hypothesis, of course, is completely ridiculous. To imagine that if you have ever spent several days on a boat, not on a lake, but on the open ocean, and then if it is the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean, that you have seen the waves, and to imagine a vegetarian mat with upright standing trees sailing actively from Africa to South America, that is ludicrous.
Especially with it being salt water. I mean, we can't survive
so you can't
more than a few days without water.
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, you're going to be dead long before you get to 60 days.
That's it, yes.
Unless
they're totally exposed to wind and sun and so on.
Yeah, and unless they take fresh water bottles. Right.
And even if you imagine that maybe some monkeys could tumble into the water during a storm in West Africa, but how these subterranean warm lizards made this transoceanic travels, not only once, but 3 or 5 times, from America to Europe and back from Europe to America and from Africa to South America.
And you have to have at least a male and a female
right.
get there, and
you need a population.
Exactly. It can't even be a pregnant female, because then how do you reproduce to have more?
Exactly. And interestingly, nobody ever attempted to make a bottleneck study there, because then you have to assume that they had a very, very strong genetic bottleneck, because events like this, since we never observed them, must be so rare that it just happens once.
Mm-hmm. The one argument that you made that I wasn't quite sure I was convinced by was the argument from stasis, because
right.
Why does evolution necessarily predict that every species is evolving to something different?
Now, I just hear on my earphones, by the way, that they're losing battery, so maybe I have to switch the battery. We will use them as long as they do. The argument would be a combination of the molecular clock hypothesis, where you have, let's say, a constant rate of genetic changes based on random events, random mutations that accumulate over time. Also, of course, producing either, even if they are not capable of producing new structures, but they would at least produce some kind of decay, which also was used by Sanford as a kind of argument against evolution, to say, well, that would be detrimental over time, this accumulation. And if you have common ancestry and you have, let's say, over 500 million years, and a average lifespan of a marine invertebrate species of, let's say, 5 million years, then you would have thousands and thousands of successive ancestor-dependent species with their accumulation of genetic changes. And then it still is strange. Of course, you can say, well, they are exceptions from the rule. That this didn't result in morphological transformations, and in other cases you have very, very fast transformations from terrestrial animal that looks like a pig to a dolphin-like whale. So it's weird. Of course, it doesn't, as evidence alone, it wouldn't refute common ancestry, but it fits into this line of let's say, cumulative evidence that makes problems for this hypothesis.
Okay. John in the chat asked quite a simple question, which you probably already addressed, but he says, my question is, why do you think there is such a gap in the fossil record between major species?
Well, my hypothesis is that the transition is not natural and is not by minor genetic changes accumulating over time and being directed by natural selection, but that these transitions are caused by infusion of information from outside of the system, and that these gaps are real and are indicative of saltational transitions. So I would be very sympathetic to a hypothesis like Goldschmidt with his hopeful monster hypothesis. Some people would say, well, that's still common ancestry. If the first bird first bird was born from a reptile egg, or some amphibious animal suddenly in the next generation had a counter-current heat exchange system in the whale lineage. But actually, I would say this is a series of miracles then, and has nothing to do with common ancestry with modification.
Any other questions folks have? Can you maybe give me what your take on Archaeopteryx as a transition between theropod dinosaurs and birds?
So of course, you have to be clear on the term. So what is a transitional fossil? So this would be a transitional fossil in terms of macroevolution, when you say, well, we assume a common ancestry of birds from dinosaur, bipedal predatory dinosaurs. And then Archaeopteryx has this kind of mosaic pattern of still some characters of dinosaurs retained, like the long tail with a lot of vertebrae, and also the stiff tail as is found in Deinonychosaurids and Troodontids, and tooth beak, which is not present in recent birds. And on the other hand, he has feathers and other characters a reduction of the fingers as modern birds. So you have this combination, some characters of the assumed ancestors, some characters of the assumed descendants, and there then Archaeopteryx indeed is in a way transitional. On the other hand, one of course has to say that this kind of transitional series you could also make with recent organisms. It's nothing special or particular for paleontology. You can make a kind of lineage from cyanobacteria over protists to placozoans to coelenterids and some kind of undifferentiated worms up to humans via lemurs and squirrel-like animals and monotrames and so on. So you can make this kind of series where then, for example, a monotrame would be transitional between reptiles and placental mammals, also among recent mammals, among recent animals. So what actually the data say is that there is a hierarchical distribution of characters, of nested combination of characters, that they are not randomly distributed, and that this fact needs explanation. And therefore, I very much like this recent suggestion of the dependency graph, where you have this nested patterns of hierarchical inherited sets of character combinations that is used in software development, totally unrelated to biology, and shows that this is also a design process that is used by software designers, and therefore should also be expected to be found in other design systems. And so we could predict even this kind of transitional forms like Archaeopteryx without assuming common ancestry, based on the design principle of reusing these kind of modules and inheriting modules to other systems.
Excellent. Okay, a couple people submitted questions in the chat. Folks, if you want, could you submit questions using the Q&A button? It just makes it easier so I don't lose questions. That would be better. But I'll read the ones that have been sent in the chat.
I think I have to switch now to the speaker from the computer, because my AirPods are losing battery.
Okay. So you ready?
Yeah, I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Okay, Ben asks, excellent presentation, Dr. Bechly. Do recent studies of small animal populations in isolated areas that tend to maintain or increase their genetic diversity instead of lose it over time, as was expected, help or harm arguments for the explanatory power of mutation and natural selection, resulting in abrupt diversification after mass extinction events?
I didn't get it acoustically. Maybe try it again more slowly.
You can open up the chat and read it yourself.
Chat window, okay.
Yeah.
And it's okay. I have it. Do recent study of small animal population. Actually, in this case, I would admit that this is outside of my expertise. I would say it has no bearing really on the question of common ancestry. It has a bearing, of course, on the question of what would be observed after a mass extinction event in terms of either diversification or maintaining of a certain morphotype. But being not a geneticist, I would be reluctant to comment on this. So.
Okay, here's another question from John. I'm curious as to if the ID movement could possibly postulate any mechanistic alternatives to the neo-Darwinian mechanism of random mutations and natural selection. I know that as an ID believer, we can postulate that information has to be somehow imputed into the genome of new species. However, I wonder whether if anyone in the ID community has come up with a specific way this was done in the past.
Right. I think there have been suggestions, and of course it depends what you're looking for. So if you're a theist already for other reasons, let's say for philosophical reasons or classical arguments for theism, then it is quite logical that you would assume that the intelligent designer is, let's say, the God of the Bible, and that then you wouldn't have problems to let's say, explain these infusions of intelligence by miraculous intervention in the same way as we would, let's say, not assume that the resurrection of Christ is based on some kind of quantum mechanical process or something. So if you look for other, let's say, identifications of the designer, and there are people who are sympathetic to the intelligent design argument who rather, let's say, argue from a point of the matrix hypothesis, or and think we're living a kind of simulation, and either we are simulated in the mind of a universal intelligence, or we are simulated in the computer of some alien kids. Then, of course, you would look for other processes, and you could even postulate that Richard Dawkins famously said that he could imagine that intelligent design is completely legit, but that aliens were manipulating the genome over Earth history, and then of course you would expect some kind of process like genetic engineering. So it depends on your metaphysics and on your identification of the designer, which is beyond the method of intelligent design, which just, let's say, detects the design signal in the pattern of natural phenomena. If you want to speculate about what did physically happen, let's say, in the origin of the bacterial flagellum, if you would have had a microscope in the first cell that developed a bacterial flagellum, would you have seen molecules shifting around and suddenly forming a flagellum like a kind of telekinetic intervention, or would you have seen a kind of giant macro mutation, which could have been explained with a kind of rare quantum mechanical event on the level of the DNA? As I said, it depends on your background and your metaphysical assumptions. I would be fine with a kind of simply miraculous intervention explanation. I don't necessarily need to find a naturalistic process to explain, let's say, how did God do it if I assume that God did it. And personally, I think that God was a designer, or at least created spiritual beings were the designers, and they don't need physical processes. They act outside, or God acts outside from space-time. So usually when we ask for causal explanations, we ask for explanations that happen inside space-time and are relations between events in space-time. But in this case, the influence comes from outside of the system, from outside of space-time, and for us would look like, boom, it's there. It's like
that
interruption of the usual case, a cause and effect.
That segues quite nicely into Mapo's question. He says, my question to Dr. Bechly is, are you saying that the appearance and evolution of life on Earth was caused by a deity or some highly advanced civilization?
Yeah, I prefer the deity because, of course, intelligent design theory and the method would be compatible. Let's say if somebody is fan of ufology and aliens, and then you could say, well, aliens could have done it. But of course, this hypothesis, this identification of the designer just shifts the problem one level further, and you would have to ask, where did the aliens come from? And our special friends from the new atheist camp would then ask, but where did God come from? But of course, if you look at the God hypothesis, then God is not something that was created or that originated in time. Therefore, the question doesn't arise, and it's a natural stopping point. And therefore, for metaphysical and philosophical reasons, I assume that the intelligent designer is God, or because there's also a legit case for very intelligent evil design. If you look at the design of certain, let's say, germs that cause diseases, I wouldn't totally exclude that created spiritual beings interfered in the course of evolution in creating, let's say, something like the AIDS virus or something. That sounds a little bit weird, but it would be well compatible. It's not necessary that God did everything that there could be other levels, let's say, of intelligence outside of space-time that interacted with nature. But generally, I prefer the God hypothesis. Not because I start with religion, but because for philosophical reasons, I think the evidence for theism in the sense of classical theism is very strong.
Mm-hmm. Jonas Noland asks a question that's a bit off topic. I'm not sure if you have expertise on this, but he says, what is the best argument against the argument that the loss of making vitamin C is proof of common descent? Physical mechanistic explanations does not apply for real world engineering designs. Is that a good argument that naturalism cannot explain the evidence?
Yeah, that's the argument from these, let's say, defunct genes. I think it's one of if we look outside of the realm of fossil evidence, then I think the best evidences for common ancestry are one, these kind of pseudogenes where you have sequences that are functional, let's say, in most mammals and produce vitamin C, and they are non-functional in primates. There are even some hypotheses how this could relate to the lifestyle of primates. And the other line of evidence would be something like viral DNA jumping genes and so on, sign elements. So these are evidences outside of my field of expertise from molecular biology, which I think can be counted in the list of evidence that supports common ancestry. I would also include, for example, let's say some atavistic structures like that rarely in dolphins you find the reoccurrence of hind flippers, which of course fits quite well with the assumption that the ancestors were quadrupedal animals, and then as atavism you get these hind flippers, and you still have the bones in other ways that are interpreted as remnants of the pectoral girdle. Well, if the genetic information is still there, that is legit evidence that is, if you look at all the evidence, and you would just look at the evidence that I presented in my presentation in favor of common ancestry and these lines of evidence, then common ancestry is a very elegant explanation of this type of evidence. And I would be still totally open to the possibility, if I look at all the evidence, that common ancestry is true. It doesn't affect my theology or my worldview. That is something that I would leave open to the empirical evidence. And if the overall evidence would, let's say, have a tipping point to common ancestry, for most part of my life, I believe in common ancestry. I still believe in some form of common ancestry. I wouldn't have a problem with it. But there are sufficient problems with the type of common ancestry as I defined it in my talk that made me at least reluctant to still accept the hypothesis as the best explanation for all of the evidence.
There's a question by John. What are your predictions as to the future of the ID movement, and when will it be fully accepted by the majority of the scientific community? I live in the UK, and I live in the UK, and the ID theory is either not known about or just shunned at because it is judged a lazy theory of giving up how to find a mechanistic answer to formulation of life from non-life or less advanced life to advanced life. I myself see the ID as falsifiable and as a legitimate theory, which is used in SETI. How can we make the majority of the scientific community that ID is a credible alternative to the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution?
Well, I think in the current climate of let's say, secularization and also predominantly inside in the natural sciences, a materialistic worldview, it will be very hard to give a fair hearing to the ID hypothesis because it is excluded a priori as impossible. At least as soon as you accept, let's say, non-naturalistic designers. So maybe aliens did it, or we're living in the matrix. That could be still in the ballpark of possibility. But as soon as metaphysical options are coming in, then it will be excluded from the discussion by definition as unscientific. I think that the turning point will come from a different side. I think it will come from physics and from a growing movement within theoretical physics and astronomy and cosmology that started out this whole paradigm of materialism, of determinism, of even realism, that let's say there is a reality that is independent from consciousness, as is suggested by a lot of results from quantum mechanics. I think that from this side there will come a growing doubt in the materialistic paradigm, and as soon as this reaches this tipping point that a majority of people starts to doubt materialism, then I think the intelligent design hypothesis will gain traction among biologists again. Also, there are some indications that a growing number of biologists, people like Eugene Koonin, for example, realize that this problem of the origin of life cannot be solved with the usual explanations within biology and natural sciences, and they already start to suggest this kind of infinite ensemble of universes to explain the origin of life. There have been the first papers by mainstream biologists suggesting that major transitions within the evolution of life are so improbable that they are only possible within an infinite multiverse of parallel universes. And of course, this is already a metaphysical hypothesis. It cannot be tested. It has a lot of weird implications in terms of making basically a rational discourse impossible. If everything that can happen does happen an infinite number of times, then we shouldn't live in this rational universe that we are experiencing. And it's an unfalsifiable, untestable hypothesis, which is not really different from the God hypothesis. And as soon as stuff like this enters the mainstream discourse in evolutionary biology for explaining not only the origin of life, but also events within the history of life, then also the window will open for let's say, non-mainstream approaches like intelligent design. So I think in the long run, our prospects are very good. In the short term, I would be very skeptical to see, let's say, intelligent design dominating the academia in 10 years or 20 years. I think is very, very unlikely. I would rather think in many decades or even centuries to make this shift. It needs a kind of paradigm shift that doesn't come overnight. It comes with the accumulation of problems that are now addressed. Now in biology, those few theoretical biologists who really address the underpinnings of evolutionary biology recognize neo-Darwinism is not sufficient. And now they look for alternatives like all these kind of niche construction and Evo-Devo and natural genetic engineering and phenotypic plasticity and so on. All this kind of untested alternatives to neo-Darwinisms, which have not yet proven their explanatory scope and power. And if these fail again, then we will reach this kind of Ptolemaic point where the epicycles didn't work anymore and where a paradigm shift is becoming more acceptable to the mainstream, but not now. That
was kind of one of the take-home messages, I think, from the Royal Society meeting in London, that so they came to a recognition that the neo-Darwinian classical scenario is failing as an explanation for the complexity and diversity of life. And so what other explanations could be involved? How could we expand the synthesis? And so then they invoke these mechanisms you just mentioned, phenotypic plasticity and niche construction and Evo-Devo and on all these things. But the one thing that wasn't talked about was, was provided, one thing was not provided is a demonstration, theoretical or empirical, that actually these things are sufficient to explain what Darwinism fails to explain.
Right, exactly. What Gerd Müller in his talk called these explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism, like the origin of phenotypic complexity and so on. None of these other approaches that were presented or that are also elaborated in the literature really addresses these fundamental problems of origin of new information, of new complex structures, of non-gradual transitions. And a further problem is that some of these alternatives in the end need neo-Darwinism to explain themselves. So for example, evolvability or phenotypic plasticity has to arise in some way, and it cannot pull itself out of the black box. So you need neo-Darwinism to explain their origin, and then it can explain maybe some detailed problems. And if neo-Darwinism fails for simple mathematical problems like the problem, the search space problem of protein origins, or other problems that show that this whole process is simply not feasible, also like the waiting time problem, then a lot of these alternatives collapse together with neo-Darwinism. So I'm quite confident that this is a temporal stage in evolutionary biology where now people are looking, of course, for naturalistic alternatives to neo-Darwinism. And if these fail, then there will come a time of turmoil. And I think then the options will come to consider more fundamental paradigmatic changes.
Mapu asks, it seems that the evidence for a non-natural explanation of life is solid. Should we conclude that Darwinists are either stupid or have a hidden motive for clinging to their position?
No. So I think they are not stupid. As I said, I think that at least the theory of common ancestry explains a lot of data quite elegantly. And I also would be reluctant to assume that all those scientists have this kind of hidden agenda. They don't want God in their life. They want to cherish their homosexual lifestyle or something. The God who tells him not to do that. I don't think that there's a kind of conspiracy. I think that most of the evolutionary biologists don't even think about the problems. I think 90% of evolutionary biologists have learned evolutionary biology at university. They accept it as a given, and they apply the theory on detailed problem, and they don't question the underpinnings of the theory. There are only few theoretical biologists really think about, let's say, mathematical problems of neo-Darwinism.
It's so ingrained in their thinking that when Darwinism makes predictions, and then those predictions fail spectacularly, rather than question the paradigm, they question whether it made those predictions in the first place. So I think a classic example of this is the literature on de novo gene birth, where you have genes that appear to arise from nowhere, from without predecessors. And if you read review papers on de novo genes, they'll say, well, it used to be thought years ago that de novo gene birth was impossible because it was so improbable to occur by the process of evolution. But then we know it's not so improbable after all, because we've got all these myriads of examples we can find.
That's a general phenomenon that we can observe, that is, as soon as conflicting data come up, they are sucked in, incorporated in the theory. The theory is expanded to accommodate the conflicting evidence. And so the goalpost is always shifted. Whatever you bring up as problem is basically in one further iteration of the process considered then as confirming evidence. Well, homoplasy is to be expected based on the evolutionary process. It's no longer considered as a problem as it was, let's say, 20 years ago. There's a reason why in cladistics homoplasy is minimized by the algorithm, because it's conflicting evidence. But now people say, well, homoplasy, that's a natural consequence of the evolutionary process. It's no problem at all. That's not evidence against common ancestry. But actually it is. If homology is evidence for common ancestry, then homoplasy is evidence against common ancestry.
It seems that much of cladistics and phylogenetics is predicated upon circular argumentation.
Yes.
Because I mean, a lot of the algorithms that you use, or the models that you employ for phylogenetic tree construction, are designed to generate a plausible looking tree.
Of course. And they are designed to produce a dichotomic tree. And actually, you can produce a dichotomic tree from a totally random, noisy data set. It just depends on the algorithm that you process the data with. And there are certain assumptions used by the method which basically produce what is expected by the scientists. And that has been acknowledged by a whole school of cladists in the 80s, which were called the pattern cladists, who acknowledged that evolutionary biology and cladistics especially is based on circular reasoning, and they tried to avoid this circular reasoning and said, well, we don't need the evolutionary assumptions. We can assume a hierarchical structure, a hierarchical pattern of similarity based on the maximization of information content. And that is interesting because this hypothesis actually can be adopted by intelligent design reasoning, that you have this information compressing feature of hierarchical storage of information. And this is to be expected by a design process as suggested by the dependency graph hypothesis.
Jonas asks, physical mechanistic explanations does not apply for explaining the origin of real-world engineering designs. Physical explanations only apply partly to explain some of the internal processes of the final product. Is that a good argument that naturalism cannot explain the evidence?
I have to read the question.
Yeah.
Again. Does not apply to. Okay, I think what the question alludes to is the fact that physical processes may explain how a motor in a car works, but it doesn't explain how the motor came into origin by intelligent planning of an engineer who did it, or it would be something like the argument that the boiling of a cup of tea can be explained by chemics and by physics, that the atoms are moving very fast and so on, but the real explanation is that Auntie Maggie wanted to cook a cup of tea. So yes, I think there are different levels of explanation, and that a naturalistic explanation can address a certain level of explanation, but that this doesn't exclude another level of explanation. But on the other hand, this doesn't mean that every phenomenon can be explained with a naturalistic level of explanation. I think there are clearly phenomena that cannot be explained with naturalistic explanations. So, for example, on the level of mental phenomena. But I think also if you look at the natural world, if it is fine-tuning in the universe of the physical constants and laws of nature, or the reason why mathematical laws of nature have some causal effect on physical reality at all, or also these different phenomena in biology that have stipulated the discipline of intelligent design. So I think there are phenomena that can in principle not be explained by a physical mechanistic explanation. I think there are phenomena that cannot plausibly explained by physical mechanistic explanation. And I think there are phenomena that can be explained by physical mechanistic explanations, but still need a different level of additional explanation that is not mechanistic. And there are some phenomena that can be completely explained by physical mechanistic explanations. So, for example, the pattern of grains of sand along the beach, if it doesn't spell John loves Mary, but it's just a pattern of sand on the beach, it can be explained by chance and necessity. So it depends on the phenomenon, if it can be explained with mechanistic explanations or
not. Okay, let's take one more. This is from Jonas. He says, but the new, more agency-dominated mechanisms of evolution leaves the question of an even stronger top-down explanation.
New, more agency-dominated mechanisms. I actually don't understand the question.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure exactly what he's saying.
Maybe he or she could. Is it from John or?
It's from Jonas.
Jonas. Okay, maybe he could rephrase.
He says he just posted natural genetic engineering.
Yeah, natural genetic engineering actually is one of the alternatives that has been proposed within this framework of extended synthesis. So along the alternatives like niche construction and what always struck me a little bit weird is how natural genetic engineering actually explains the origin of complex information, because I can imagine that certain elements are transposed between different parts of the genome, but how the information originates in the first place is not really explained by natural genetic engineering. So there has been another approach in a book called Evolution 2.0, who suggested a kind of synthesis of intelligent design and theistic evolution. Basically, the author suggested that the intelligence that is involved in the intelligent designing is not God, but is this kind of, the bacterium designs its own flagellum, which of course is a little bit weird because we have no indication that a bacterium has the level of intelligence required to design a flagellum motor and to assemble it. But of course, it's not more absurd than the matrix hypothesis. So I think it is among these intelligent design similar hypothesis, which I would consider as very implausible.
Okay. Yep. So let's end with that. But thanks so much, Gunter, for coming on and talking to us. It's a fascinating presentation, and I enjoyed the session very much. So I'll sign off here, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.
Yeah.